Oh, hello, and welcome to another fun filled edition of Adam's Music Box. And today, like Bill O'Reilly before us, we'll do it live. Because we're talking all about live music and why some genres and styles of music rather tend to work really well in live settings and others don't. But the story's actually a bit more complicated and granular than all that. So let's start at the very beginning. Live music just used to be music because there was no way to hear music prior to the 19th century short of hearing it live. Of course, you had things like the music box, but when it comes to reproductions of various instruments and of the human voice, you needed to be in the presence of the vocalist or instrumentalist, or you needed to do it yourself. You could be in a room alone playing the guitar, piano, singing to yourself, and that was, of course, also live music with a very selective audience, as the blokes in Spinal Tap might say. But in the 19th century, this all changed. You had the advent of mechanical self playing instruments, most famously the player piano, but also many varieties of organ with lots of additional percussion and wind instruments, even that were mechanically playable. And then, of course, you had the advent of recorded sound and radio, which meant that you no longer needed to be in a geographical location with a musician to hear music, nor did you need any musical talent yourself to enjoy the sounds of music alone. This was a huge game changer. It's the kind of thing that we take for granted today because, everyone's walking around with their iPhones and their earbuds and all of the blue teeth and all the rest of it. But this wasn't always the case. And in the long history of mankind making music, going back to cavemen beating on drums right up to the present day, it's a fairly narrow period in which we've been able to say that we can listen to the production of music absent a musician being in our physical presence. But like I said, that's sort of the preamble to the story. Let's really get into it. So, to understand why some genres of music work better live than others, while others tend to be more favored in their recorded form or on radio, same thing in the modern era, we have to look at music's relationship with architecture because this is really where it all begins. So prior to the 19th century, the places where people encountered music the most were in liturgical settings, churches, and the other place people would encounter them would be in private facilities, namely the homes of great aristocrats or monarchs or various social clubs that they would form, including various early Philharmonic societies. Now, the term chamber music literally comes from the fact that that music was played in the chambers of great aristocratic manors. Now, some of them were rather large rooms, but they weren't as big as a church. The music played in these various locations therefore developed in response to the physical requirements and demands of the architecture itself. So, for instance, what kind of music was very common in these chambers? Well, you had string quartets, you had some octets, you had solo piano, you had piano trio, you had essentially rarely more than 10 musicians in one room at one time because that was all you needed. In fact, 10 was more than you needed to fill that kind of room because a string quartet was more than adequate to fill that kind of space. In a church, things were very different. Churches, traditionally very large buildings. When we talk about cathedrals, some of the largest buildings in the world up to the point of the late modern era. And so, what kinds of sounds, what kinds of instruments were used in these liturgical settings? Well, things that could fill the room with sound without people straining to hear it. That's why the organ became very important. And as cathedrals got bigger, the organs got bigger, more sophisticated, more dynamic. And of course, a choir is something that can be as voluminously loud or as petite and quiet as you want it to be. The larger the choir, the louder it is. And because human beings don't require you to, erect a big organ and expand it with all the mechanics, if you had a large cathedral, you simply had many people in the choir. So the short answer is that loud music, and by that I mean music that is able to be dynamic, music that has a very wide dynamic range, that tends to work very well in large architectural spaces where it would be deafening to the point of being inaudible in a small space. Conversely, things like a string quartet don't really work well in big architectural spaces. Yes, you will see churches that put on musical programs, and some of them will include string quartets, and in smaller churches that might work very well. But think of a huge cathedral, and think of a string quartet in there. Because of the small size of the ensemble, it might not be able to be heard throughout the cathedral. And even if it is, the reverberation will be such that the detail, which is really where string quartets excel, that level of detail will be lost, while the more swelling tones, both literally and metaphorically, of an organ will reverberate much more nicely. Yes, there'll be a lot of echo, but it works more with an organ, especially when played more slowly and deliberately. And this brings us to the other truism that relates to this relationship between architecture and music. The slower a piece of music is, the more legato a piece of music is, the better it works in large physical settings, in large buildings. By contrast, the more detailed, the more staccato, and the more fast a piece of music is, or an interpretation of such a piece of music is, the more it works in small settings, either in the manner of a great home or in sort of these micro concert halls, these smaller venues that you see. And obviously, as classical music evolved in the 19th century, this would have a major impact because the growth in terms of size of its members of the traditional European symphony orchestra happened at the same time that the concert halls that housed these orchestras were getting bigger. And you could say, for instance, that there's a bit of a chicken and egg thing going on, but I would say that the architecture in general was a response to these orchestras. So, what happened? Well, Wagner was someone, well, he was a great, one of the great composers of all time, but even beyond that, he was someone who became frustrated in the middle of the 19th century at the lack of quality and professionalism and uniformity across orchestras in the wider Germanic world. So that would include the German principalities, because Germany wasn't a united country at that time, and the Germanic core of the Austrian Empire, centered around Vienna, Linz, and other cities. Strasbourg, not Strasbourg. Having a Joe Biden moment, folks. Salzburg. That's it. Strasbourg is in another country altogether. Anyway, Wagner wanted to professionalize the orchestra, and he very much did. The Wagnerian reforms to the Central European orchestras, and eventually all the great orchestras of Europe, it involved having conductors that really understood their role as that of an equal to the composer, whereby the sound that the audience hears, the final artistic product, is one half what the composer put on the written score, the page, and then the other part, the conductor, the maestro's unique artistic interpretation and statement that he makes to the audience through his leadership, his direction of the orchestra. And what of the orchestral members themselves? Well, in Wagner's era, Wagner made sure that these orchestras had members that were full-time professionals rather than a mix of amateurs and what we might retrospectively call semi-pros. They were dedicated, their skill was much higher. The quality of the instruments, particularly the wind and brass instruments and the percussion, became much more mechanically advanced, which allowed much more precise and more beautiful playing by the musicians. And most importantly, for the sake of this conversation, the size of the orchestras grew. We went from orchestras that might have had, 20 to 30 to 40 members to, by the mid 19th century, we're talking 90, and in the case of some opera orchestras, 100 members. The orchestras were getting very large. Now, what did that mean? It meant, among other things, that many of the venues in which symphony orchestras were playing in the late 18th and early 19th century were too small for these orchestras. And as this type of music became less about exclusivity and more about democratization, something else that Wagner pioneered, you needed large concert halls and opera houses to hold the big orchestras, so big stages, and you needed a larger area of seating for the larger audiences now that classical music was being democratized, and that no matter who you are or what your background was, you could buy a ticket and see the show. And the prices were much fairer than they were, let's say, in a lot of places today. So that's an example of architecture and music working in symbiosis. Although I will say, on the whole, the creation of these modern Wagnerian, ultra professionalized, really beautiful and wonderful orchestras somewhat preceded the concert halls. You've got these big orchestras, and then civic leaders and orchestral leaders themselves said, look, we need grand concert halls and opera houses that are worthy of these big orchestras from both a pragmatic point of view of getting the audience in, having a big enough stage, but also from the point of view of having grand venues befitting of an increasingly grand style of music. Now, of course, chamber music hasn't gone away. The grand opera and the grand symphony orchestra have always coexisted in the modern era with the chamber musician, but it's typically best when these are played in different environments. Now, there are some instances where people programming a show at a big concert hall will have a string quartet or octet go on the stage. And even in a venue with really great acoustics, it just doesn't work. You need a huge 80-piece plus orchestra in these big concert venues from the 19th and 20th centuries in order to really fill the sound. And when you don't, and I've experienced this and it's really unpleasant, if you're anywhere sort of other than in the first 10 or so rows, you struggle to hear it when it's not a big orchestra. Imagine some of these huge theaters, some of these huge venues where, you know, you might have 3,000 seats. The guy up in the back of the nosebleed won't hear anything unless you've got this big orchestra capable of powerful fortes and even pianissimo sections that are still full enough that they can project to the back of a concert hall, irrespective of the acoustical properties of the hall in play. Now, why do they program music that doesn't involve 80-piece orchestras in these concert halls? Greed and stupidity is the best thing I can think of. Lack of creativity and a misunderstanding by some of the people programming these venues about what the venues offer. Programming a string quartet in a 3,000 seat concert hall is as foolish as putting an 80-piece orchestra in a tiny little venue in someone's house that maybe, you know, or a hotel ballroom that maybe can fit 100 people in there. It just doesn't make sense. There's almost as many people on stage as there is in the audience, and that's not just because it's free jazz night. Some will get it. And so it's important when you're programming a musical concert to really understand this delicate relationship between the architecture and the style of music, the number of musicians, and the dynamic range of the music being played. Now, what about other forms of music? Well, let's look at opera. And we mentioned the opera orchestra before, but let's look at the actual opera singers. Now, opera long predated the invention of electronic amplification. No microphones, no amps, no large public address speaker systems. And so, what did opera singers have to do? They developed an exaggerated style of singing that is all about projecting from the diaphragm so that you can have a loud voice that projects all the way to the back of these big halls and can compete with a huge string section and brass section. Now, obviously, even the best opera singers, when the orchestra's full-blown tutti, can't compete, but that's why you'll never see a tutti section in the orchestra. That means with all of the orchestra playing in unison while the male or female vocalist is singing, whether, you know, you've got bass, baritone, tenor, soprano, alto, soprano, mezzo soprano, all of you, we know it all. And so this style was very much exaggerated. And when people sort of think of your stereotypical opera singer clutching his diaphragm, that is the origin of that. And many other forms of popular singing and folk singing that involved big venues had to evolve like this. Now, the original folk music that would have been played on a haystack in a village square and a little saloon or a pub or wherever, you could sing in a bit more of a natural style. But in the age of music hall and vaudeville, the people who were singing had to develop a quasi operatic style in order for their voices to project to the back of these big halls. It often involved a lot of vibrato, a lot of sort of over projection. And while the style of singing isn't necessarily natural, people have found it to be very beautiful. Again, we think of that stereotypical opera singer, and the reason that that stereotype evolved is out of architectural necessity. That all changed when electronic amplification became widespread, when we had the microphone. And this allowed vocalists to tailor their style to be more intimate, to require less vibrato, require less projection from the diaphragm. You got, even though diaphragm singing is the way to project, or to protect rather, the voice most carefully, you had people who were a bit more throaty singers, or God help us, even nasally singers. But one of the first people to really gain success as a virtuoso in this new style that the microphone made possible was Bing Crosby. Because the microphone allowed Bing Crosby to sing as though he was sitting next to you, serenading two or three people from the comfort of his chair, as opposed to this more Caruso like style, this operatic style, this Mario Lanza style of projecting to the back of a hall. Now, obviously, people like Bing Crosby could have sung that way in small groups at a pub or a saloon, but the age of popular music demanded big audiences in order to make a profit that was a justifiably good ROI, a justifiably good return on investment. And so Bing was able to fill theaters and other concert venues that were the same size as the major opera houses. And he was able to do so while maintaining the integrity of his style because of the good old fashioned, at that time it wasn't old fashioned, microphone. And this style of singing, broadly called crooning, has influenced every subsequent style of singing because you no longer need to project to the back of an auditorium in order to get your voice heard. And it's even had an influence on operatic, or let's call them quasi operatic singers. Think of someone whose name will probably come up again in this video. Think of Freddie Mercury, the king of sort of pop opera style hybrids in terms of popular vocal work. Now, he could certainly project to the back of a hall without a microphone. He had that powerful diaphragm, that great vibrato. But what about 100,000-seater football arena? Stadium rather, that wouldn't be easy without the microphone. The microphone made it possible. So this was a technological advance which changed the relationship of singers and architectural styles, and it also had the effect of allowing new vocal styles to be brought to huge big venues. Now, what about jazz? Another important style that came out in the 1920s. Well, jazz originally was not intended to be amplified. And so a lot of the early bands in the Dixieland era, the so called trad era, they were rather large and they had a lot of brass, they had loud percussion, they had things that could, fill a large venue without the need for amplification. In the 30s and 40s, you also had the era of the big band. These big bands, while sometimes they would rely on amplification for things like the singer who would accompany them, generally when they were simply doing instrumental numbers, they did not need any amplification, even when they were filling these huge traditional 2,000, in some cases 3,000 seat theaters. But then jazz changed at the end of the 1940s and it became more of an intimate style. The bebop era coincided with the end of big bands. The music became more intricate, it became faster. The kinds of solos people did became more meticulous. It was a kind of music, in other words, that was tailor made, not by intention, but certainly by result, for different kinds of venues. And thus we see the great flourishing of the jazz club. Now, there have always been clubs, and small clubs were never very friendly to a big band because you couldn't fit a big band into these clubs. But when jazz clubs really became indispensable to the genre began in the bebop era, which then translated into the hard bop era, the modal jazz era, just about every form of jazz up until the late 60s, early 70s. Jazz became club music. Put it in a theater, and the reverberation, the echo would mean that you'd lose the intricacy of that great saxophone solo. Put it in a football stadium, well, that's just not going to happen. And you could argue that's because jazz never reached that level of popularity, but maybe that was because no one could conceive of putting jazz in a football stadium, because even with amplification, the intricacy of the music would, in most instances, be lost, and therefore no one would enjoy themselves at the time, in the venue. Um, Moving right along, we enter the era of rock and roll. Now, rock and roll from the very beginning, or let's say from almost the very beginning, relied on amplification, not just for the vocals, but for the instrument that became the lodestone of the rock genre. If saxophone is indelibly associated with jazz, and if violin is indelibly associated with European classical music, the electric guitar is indelibly associated with rock and roll music. And it didn't take very long for the upright contrabassos that you would see in Elvis's early bands to become electric bass guitars. And likewise, the acoustic upright pianos or even grand pianos were rapidly replaced by things like Hammond organ, Fender Rhodes electric pianos, and other amplified keyboard instruments. And while drums never had any trouble sounding loud, the drum sets, of course, got bigger as the sound of rock and roll got bigger. Now, this meant that for a club, rock and roll was, if anything, too loud. You needed bigger clubs, or you needed clubs where people didn't care about going deaf. For theaters, it generally worked very well. But when you get to a large theater, let alone an arena or a stadium, things were difficult, because while the amplification on a guitar amp, an electric bass amp, the amp attached to a Fender Rhodes, a Leslie speaker attached to a Hammond organ, that was great for a club or most theaters. But once you got to the big venues like a football stadium, that was not enough. Case in point, one of the reasons the Beatles became so despondent after their famous Shea Stadium tour is that they had no PA system. They were just playing out of their relatively meager amplifiers. And so the audience could barely hear the music. And that's before you take into account all of the female screaming. And so we enter a new age in the mid and late 60s, the age of the modern public address system. Now, the name public address system doesn't derive from music, as the name would suggest. It derives from, train stations and other places where, the train when people, making announcements you couldn't hear. Obviously, as the technology got better, people could hear them. But by the late 60s, you had a lot of innovators like the Clare brothers, for instance, who were working on making PA systems specifically designed for music, and particularly for the modern rock and roll audiences. The amplifiers kept getting bigger on stage, the drum sets kept getting bigger, but still, rockers had their sights set on something bigger. And at the end of the day, it's generally easier to magnify the sound of music that is already amplified compared to music that doesn't require amplification. Meaning, it's easier to take a Marshall guitar amplifier and make it loud enough to fill a stadium via a public address system than it is with, let's say, the pan flute. Both are entirely possible with modern public address systems, but in the early days of these modern rock-orientated public address systems, people were following the lead of music that was easy to amplify. Now, most forms of rock and roll tend not to be as intricate as jazz. In the 70s and even the late 60s, a lot of exceptions challenged that. But in general, rock and roll was a genre much like opera and big symphony orchestras that was tailor-made for larger than life venues. So if jazz was the 20th century's version of chamber music, best for the club, for the small setting, for the coffee house, the Wagnerian orchestra, in terms of dynamic range and in terms of its relationship with architecture and with physical venues, that genre was absolutely rock and roll. And I think that one of the reasons rock and roll became the dominant genre that informed the new language of post mid 60s popular music, one of the reasons was because it was one of the first genres outside of classical music to be profitable in big venues. And then once you got rock and roll into the arenas and stadiums, it became the most profitable genre in music, other than pop music itself. But that just means popular. And the rock music of the 60s, 70s, 80s, that was the main vector, if you will, of the pop music world that even influenced traditional vocal singer songwriting styles and traditional singing of other people's songs, as pop music generally was. And the history of rock and roll was about getting bigger. The amps got bigger, the venues got bigger, the public address systems got bigger. And because of the nature of the music, because of the inherent need to amplify the music, stadiums became a major music venue, even though they were never intended to be that. Dating back to the Roman era, stadiums were places for sport, places where the visual aspect is more important. Because obviously, yes, it makes a sound when you hit a baseball bat, and when you tackle someone in a football field, it makes a sound. But sports are really more, unless you're playing the sports where it's very much physical. When you're observing sports, it's all about the visual. And that's how it was from the age of the Roman Colosseum up to the 1960s, when these public address systems made the sporting venues perfect for large scale music. Now, a lot of genres that came after rock and roll, though they required levels of amplification, they didn't necessarily fit the bill. And this again has to do with the style of the music. You can enjoy a rock and roll concert without necessarily hearing every single syllable pronounced by the singer. You can hear the guitars, you can hear the electric organs, you can hear the bass guitar, the drums, etc., and you get the feeling, you get the vibe. What about hip hop, though? A genre that not only relies much more on lyrics than just about any other genre, but which relies on the intricacy of lyrics. Well, where did hip hop originate? Hip hop originated on the streets, in the basements, in the apartments, and shortly thereafter in the clubs. Hip hop, much like jazz, was very much a club orientated genre, because just as you needed to hear the detail of a trumpet or saxophone or piano solo in a bebop or hard bop jazz group, in hip hop you needed to hear every single syllable. And we're told this is pre mumble rap. This is when MCs actually in the 80s and 90s had to have talent. And so, as hip hop became so popular on the radio and in terms of physical music sales, records, tapes, later on CDs, etc., the question came, well, how do we make this something possible in big venues? Well, not necessarily the easy, but the intuitive solution is to improve PA systems. And PA systems obviously have got better and better over the years, so much so that you could just about by the end of the 90s get away with hip hop in an arena or a stadium without the lyrics being totally lost to the reverberation. But then there's the other question of hip hop not necessarily having the physical visual presence of other genres unless you're up close. In a club, you'll be able to see the clothing. that the MC or the DJ will be wearing. And fashion has been I would say, much more important part of hip hop than it ever was with rock and roll. But what about in a big venue? Well, the solution to that was the ye old operatic solution: give them something visual. And that's why by the end of the 90s, you saw hip hop groups and hip hop artists going into the big venues and becoming more and more adept at creating big visual stage sets. The king of this was and still is Ye, the artist formerly known as Kanye West. He was someone with the uncanny ability to do with hip hop what you couldn't ever really do with chamber music or jazz. And that's that he turned it into opera. He turned it into theater with visuals and with dramatic action happening on stage. And now that everyone's copied him, no one blinks twice when a hip hop style artist is in a big arena or football stadium. But based on what was happening at the end of the 90s, when you had people like Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg and Eminem taking big hip hop tours throughout the country with increasingly elaborate stages, with 64 Impalas driving across them, etc. Kanye West, as he was known in the early 2000s, really perfected this idea of spectacle, making up for the otherwise intimacy that is traditionally associated with hip hop. And this is also what happened in the 70s with jazz fusion. As jazz became increasingly amplified, in spite of its intricacies, jazz did enter some pretty big venues. You had bands like Mahavishnu Orchestra, Return to Forever with Chick Corea, Headhunters with Herbie Hancock, Weather Report with Joe Zawinul, Wayne Shorter, and many others. And because of these bands' reliance on amplification, fusion, and one of the things they fused from rock were the electric instruments, some of these bands could just, in spite of their intricacies, just about get away with playing larger venues than you would expect for an acoustic bebop, hard bop, or modal jazz band. Now, getting back to rock and roll doesn't necessarily need visuals, but a lot of rock bands did find that as they were going into these larger and larger venues, they needed something more than sound to fill the venue. They needed to satisfy a visual element other than four guys playing their guitars. Well, they're not all playing, there's a drummer, but you know what I mean, on stage. And one of the early pioneers of this, and the band that also probably pushed it to a level of perfection like no other, was Pink Floyd. So much so that by the early 80s, they were playing behind a wall, a literal wall that they would build on stage. So you couldn't see them at all. You could hear them behind the wall because of the amplifiers, but you couldn't see them. This was opera. This was visual theater. And Pink Floyd inspired so many other artists to take rock concerts and make them into truly theatrical events. You had so many bands with light shows, Genesis, for instance, using the first computer programmable stage lights known as the Vari-Light system in the 80s. Queen were very good with lights, but Queen were also very interesting in that because of the microphone and because of another thing that came out in the 80s, the large scale Jumbotron, that's the Sony brand, but there were others that did the same thing. People could really get an intimate flavor of the lead singer, Freddie Mercury, because of that device. Now, Freddie was entertaining audiences and making everyone feel like they were in the front row interacting with him even before the Jumbotron, because he was one of these unique people who, much like Pink Floyd did in a visual sense, Freddie, in a sense of pure entertainment, understood that you can use charisma if you've got enough of it to make the person in the back of that football stadium feel like he's in the front row. Of course, it takes a microphone because otherwise the guy in the very back couldn't hear you, but charisma can do a lot. And when you brought the Jumbotron into it, it did help take even the biggest venue and make it feel a bit smaller. It was a piece of technology that created intimacy. So, what is the moral of this story? Well, it's that architecture, and after that, technology, the microphone, the amplified instruments, the PA system, the jumbotron, the stage set, which is sort of one part technology, one part architecture. All of these things have an influence on what kind of music works better in what venues. The style of the music itself, staccato, fast, intricate, always better in smaller venues, deliberate, legato, dynamic, loud, slow, even. These things tend to work better in larger venues. And yes, we can use various forms of acoustic technology and various kinds of PAs, delays that are built into PAs now to make it so that you can play almost anything anywhere. But these traditional rules about fast, detailed equals intimate architecture, and grand legato loud leaning towards big architecture, it all goes back to the chamber orchestra of the smaller room to the big organ in the cathedral. The more things change, the more they stay the same, even with subtle improvements to our acoustical design and technology over the years. So that's my answer to that question of what sound and what kind of music works best live. As always, let me know what you think. You can like and subscribe. And of course, we will see you next time. Take care.